Ian, thank you all very much for coming today. And I'm just delighted to be sharing this session, which is on the fascinating topic of what have survey experiments taught us about decisions to use nuclear weapons. And as many of you know, there have been a good number of them in recent years, and some very, very serious work has gone on in this area. So we have a fantastic team to discuss it today.
Mode rather than presenter mode, the Weiner.
I think I'm getting a bit of feedback.
Full screen.
I think it's Paul.
And pleasure of introducing another Rose. That is so unusual. And I'm very pleased to be sharing the podium with Rose McDermott, who is the David and Mariana Fisher University Professor of International Relations at Brown University and a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She does a lot of work on American foreign and defense policy, experimentation, national security intelligence, gender, social identity, cybersecurity, emotion and decision-making, and the biological and genetic basis of political behavior. So a very wide range of research. And I'm always delighted to see Rose here at CSAC. She's been here before on several occasions, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back. Our second speaker today is not someone that I am, yes, please turn off your phones. Thank you. Our second speaker today is one who I have not been acquainted with in the past, except over Zoom, but I am delighted to meet in person Paul Slovic, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon and a founder and president of Decision Research. He studies human judgment, decision-making, and the psychology of risk. With colleagues worldwide, he has developed methods to describe risk perceptions and measure their impacts on individuals and society. His recent work examines psychic numbing. This sounds like a fascinating topic, Paul. Psychic numbing and the failure to respond to mass human tragedies. He has been elected recently to the, not so recently, 2016, to the American Academies of Arts and Sciences in 2015 and the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. And last but by no means least is my good friend Sharon Weiner, who is an associate professor in the School of International Service at American University, as well as visiting professor, researcher for the program on science and global security at Princeton University. Sharon and I have worked together on and off for many years. Her research, teaching, and policy engagement are at the intersection of organizational politics and US national security. Her current work focuses on the theory, practice, and social construction of deterrence, the politics of US nuclear weapons modernization, which is a very hot topic, and larger issues of civil military relations. So without further ado, a warm welcome to you all, a warm welcome to our panelists. They will be speaking for about 45 minutes. Then we'll throw open the floor for your questions and comments. And we are, as you can tell, beginning with Paul. So a warm welcome once again.
Thank you. I'm always glad to be back to this campus where I graduated from a long time ago. And this is a topic of survey experiments. I did my first experiment as a student here in January of 1959, 65 years ago. So now we do it a little differently. But anyway, I'm glad to be back here. And you can see from the title, it's a rather weird title. I'll try to make it interesting and understandable to you. So what's the talk about? And I'm going to go quickly because we have to share the time, but my slides are available if anyone wants them afterwards. So it's about rational management of nuclear weapons that depends on skilled decision-making in situations of risk. Decision-making has been studied scientifically for more than 60 years. Much has been learned about how decisions go wrong and why. And our aim here is to briefly describe some of this research based on survey experiments and argue that what we have learned is essential for managing America's and the world's nuclear arsenals more safely. So we key off of Scott Sagan and Ben Valentino's famous paper from the 2017. I hope that perhaps they're tuned in on Zoom. very appreciative to this paper, which has kept us busy replicating, extending it for a number of years. It's a very provocative paper with dramatic results, showing many people, Americans supported nuclear strike against Iran in a scenario I'll talk about in a minute. But you could predict whether a person was supportive of America using nuclear weapons against Iranian civilians by whether they supported the death penalty or not. Republicans were more in favor of the nuclear option than Democrats, and women were at least as much supportive as men, and many more interesting findings in this paper, which my colleagues and I have consistently replicated and sometimes extended over the years. So I'm going to talk about a new study that was just data was just collected in the fall, based on this scenario, where people read a news story about a difficult ground war between Iran and the US. They're then asked whether they would, as a decision maker, prefer to continue this ground war, which is not going particularly well, at the risk of losing the lives of US soldiers. But we're going to win this war eventually, but we may lose military, or to launch a nuclear strike on an Iranian city to end the war and prevent further losses of American troops. So this is what they read. It's too much to read here, but the gist of it is that the US had sanctioned Iran economically to punish violations of a nuclear treaty. Iran then attacked the US on the ground. The ground war was difficult, and an additional 20,000 troops are expected to die in this ground war if it continues, but the US will eventually win the war, but possibly lose the troops. The US is considering dropping a nuclear bomb to end the war on Iran, to end the war and protect the lives of the troops. And then the scenario branches. In one scenario, the bomb would kill an estimated 100,000 Iranian civilians, and the second branch would kill 2 million in a separate survey, 2 million civilians. So our design in this study is new. We decided it's always been 20,000 troops that died. What if it was 40,000, or a small number down to 100, 1,000, 800? And then there's a nil condition where we don't talk about the troops in this story. We just say that the war has gone on a long time, and there's political opposition in the U.S. to continuing it. So it's a political cost, and we don't focus attention on the troops. Every survey responded expressed their preference twice. This is also new. At time one, they only saw two options: either continue this ground war and possibly lose the troops but win the war, or do a nuclear strike with either 100,000 or 2 million fatalities, depending on conditions. The 100,000, we call them the A conditions. The 2 million were the B conditions. And then after that, we brought them back, and we had them make another decision where we put both nuclear strikes in the same choice set along with the ground war. So the questions, at time one, given the facts in the article, do you prefer to continue the ground war or prefer to launch the nuclear strike? Time two, and that's the new part. Suppose you learn the military has suggested a revised bombing plan with 2 target locations in the city being under consideration. Their report to the president estimates that a nuclear strike on location A would kill an estimated 100,000 civilians. Strike on B would be estimated to kill 2 million. In light of this information, which would you prefer, the ground war or to strike A location A and it might kill 100,000, or strike location B with the 2 million? So that's the design. And the aims, we wanted to see how the number of troops at risk would affect things. We predicted that the more troops at risk, the more likely a person would be to want to use the bomb. We also, and with the 2 strike options, we were testing a phenomenon well known to consumer marketing people called the decoy effect, also known as the attraction effect, where we predicted that killing 100,000 civilians would look better when compared to killing 2 million, hence would gain in support. And then we tested and explained a surprising finding by Sagan and Valentino that women were at least as supportive as men of using nuclear bombs against civilians. So this is the study design. There are basically 14 separate surveys, each with 200 people, depending on how many troops are killed and whether the bomb would kill 100,000 or 2 million. and we call these the A conditions and the B conditions, about 200 people or more in each of these separate sub-surveys. So very quickly on the results, there's no nuclear taboo. Sagan and Valentino found this as well, just a deadly utilitarian form of cost-benefit analysis. So you see, as you within the 100K or the 2 million panels, as you go, as the more troops that are expected to die, the higher the percentage of people who want to bomb the civilians. And then down at the far left, where we call it nil, where we didn't mention the troops, that was the lowest percentage, but still 13% or so, 14% wanted to bomb. So that's the first result, very systematic result. What about Republicans and Democrats? Sagan and Valentino found that Republicans were more likely to strike. Well, here in every one of these conditions, you see the Republicans in the red, are a higher percentage of them want to drop the bomb than Democrats. It's very consistent, and of course it mostly goes up with the number of troops, except it's flatter for the Democrats. We created Sagan and Valentino. You looked at the death penalty and as a predictor of this, and we expanded this to 8 items. We call it the punishment index, but there's more than just punishment going on. You know, not only the death penalty, do you favor the death penalty, but do you believe in hell, the ultimate punishment? Do you believe in punishing women who are seeking abortion? You want to protect the gun rights. You support do we think America needs a mighty leader who will punish bad people? This may sound familiar. Do you think we should close the southern border to stop illegal immigration? Don't remove Confederate monuments. And you think that some people deserve to suffer. It's a sadism item. So we scored people. We give them 1 point for every time they endorse one of these things. So they could get a score from 0 to 8. If they endorse 0 or 1, we call them low punishers. Medium was endorsing 2 to 4, and anything over 5 was high. We divided this to get kind of equal numbers in the 3 categories. So how does punishment relate to the nuclear strike in these 2 A and B conditions? Very systematic, particularly once you get away from the low, you see a significant percentage of people who want to strike. So punishment is a predictor, a strong predictor. And how about in the individual conditions? In every single condition, there's showing 12 conditions here, you see the stepping up from low to middle to high punishers. You see an increase in the percentage who want to do the nuclear strike. So these hostile, antisocial, punitive attitudes are very predictive of a person's desire to use the strike to save the troops and and so forth. What about men and women? Well, in basically almost every condition, women, a higher percentage of women want to strike than men. It's very consistent, except in 2 conditions. Those are on the far left of each panel, where we didn't give the number of troops. And in those 2 conditions, you see that men are a little bit more supportive of nuclear strikes than men. And basically, with other data in the surveys, we were able to show that women are more sensitive to protecting the troops, like they may be one's sons and daughters, than men. Not that men don't care about that, but women care more. Here's what one woman said. This is just, we asked people to write paragraphs of what they're thinking at time 2 when they made these decisions. You know, to be completely honest, I'm a military mother, and my sons spent the past 9 months at sea, sitting ducks in the Red Sea because they're being, harassed by Iran. It's been great suffering for us sailors living on a ship waiting for the next attack. I want to end Iran. I'd take them right off the map. This was a Republican woman who was a high punisher, but you see that she's thinking of her son in this case. And we find this in other evidence as well. This is one of the explanations. So now look at the decoy effect. This is really novel. It's a pricing strategy that businesses use to get us to switch from one option to a more expensive or profitable one for them. So it occurs when the preference for one of 2 options changes dramatically after a third similar but less attractive option is added. So we'll look at a version of this in this scenario. We predict that the 100K option added at time 2 in group B, which first only saw the 2 million, will look better than the 2 million option and will become more preferred. So here's what it looks like in all these different conditions. On the left of each pair of bars is how many people chose the 2 million strike at time 1, 2 million versus the ground war. That's the blue. The next to it is what happens when you put the 100,000 into the mix, and you see a lot of people choose the 100,000. There's still a residual number that choose the 2 million, and the total is increased over if you just had the 2 million. So not only does it increases the number of people who support striking things. We also then created personal risk profiles for each person in the survey based on these 3 powerful predictors, whether you're male or female, and these are all we dichotomized them. Whether you did not think of comparing the 100,000 bomb and the 2 million bomb when they were in the same choice set, we call that an O, or did compare the bombs, we call it a B. And if you scored 0 or 1 on the punishment scale, or anything over 2 or over, we call that high punishment. This creates 8 personal types, depends on the binary preferences, going from MOL, a male who didn't compare bombs and was a low punisher, and at the other end, the FBH was a female who did notice that the 100,000 bomb looked better and was a high punisher, and then all these other individual types in between. And here's the data. It's beautiful, ugly data. So it's both, whether it's the A or B panels, it looks pretty much the same. So just to, we could spend a lot of time making the different comparisons. There's a lot of different experiments where 2 conditions differ only in one way, and the other variables are controlled. But look, for example, at the far left, the men who don't notice the bomb and who are low punishers. 1 out of 93 people chose to bomb, and then on the far right, the women who notice the bomb and are high punishers, 75% choose to bomb. So there's a 70-fold increase, and then there's a lot of variation in between. For example, if you look at each panel, like the first one on the far left, the MOL, and then you go to the right and you see FOL. The only difference there is male to female, and there's not much difference there. But you can then pair each of these with what happens when it switches over to I'm sorry, well, I don't want to get into the weeds of all these comparisons, but you see that the typology of a person based on these variables is highly predictive of their support for nuclear weapons. Okay, so what have we learned? I'm not going to go through all of this, but obviously a shockingly high percentage of our respondents said they prefer to use nuclear weapons. The makeup of the choice set matters and destabilizes preferences. All of these things destabilize the preferences. They bounce them around and very greatly. And there's a lot of individual things we learn, which I don't have time to discuss. Sagan and Valentino concluded that their experiments couldn't tell us how future US presidents and their top advisors would weigh the options in this kind of a conflict. But this is the only place we kind of differ from them. We think there's no reason to believe that the minds of our military leaders and civilian officials are immune to the strong biasing factors we have demonstrated in this survey experiment. And this has implications for the management of nuclear weapons, which we may want to discuss in the Q of A. So I'm going to skip through that. I mean, one obvious implication is why do we let one person with whatever type they are make this decision, and what are the implications there? So with that, I'll turn it over to Rose. Thank you.
I don't have slides because there are a lot of slides, but I'm really delighted to be here, like Paul, at my alma mater. And I was both an undergraduate and a graduate student here. But even more significantly, my mother actually lived in this building as her dorm. And in those days, they didn't let any men in the building. So some things have changed in Encina Hall, although not all that much. I wanted to just make 3 sort of overarching comments to highlight some of the more generative and and Valentino put forward. So we have a tremendous debt to them, of course, for designing this paradigm that has been so useful to us in thinking through how to do extensions and expansions. So I want to make first a methodological point, then a theoretical point, and then one related to the policy implications of it. So the methodological point really starts with Scott and Ben, which is to say that we can actually learn a lot from these experiments. So even though they are with civilian populations, as Paul said at the end, we think that these biases are pretty close to universal, and we show them in pretty large populations. And so there's a lot that can be learned by using experiments. About what are the limits of this therapy? How high will people actually go in thinking about the number of civilians that they're willing to kill in an attack and so on? So we believe that these experiments are a really useful methodological tool to inform not only public opinion, but our understanding of leader decision making and the relevant populations and scope conditions to which it applies. The second point is more theoretical and builds on the argument that Paul was making about the decoy effect, which is this notion that you can actually change people's preferences, not just because they change their preference, but because of the alternative set. So, in a classical economic kind of sense, if I say, do you prefer chocolate to vanilla? It shouldn't matter if I add strawberry and butter pecan and, a number of other flavors. You should have a stable preference. And what the work in marketing shows, but also the work that these experiments that Paul was just discussing shows, is that your preference is not actually as stable as economists assume. That by changing the other options, you actually change the preference ordering of the thing that you might otherwise prefer or choose. There's another piece of this that Paul didn't mention, but that I think is also worth noting, which is something that previous work in psychology has shown, which is extremeness aversion. That people may have this bias where all of a sudden, if they have an option of 2 million versus 0, they may accept 2 million. But then once they have another option, it makes it easy to say, oh, well, I'm going to do the middle thing, right? But what they don't recognize is the middle thing can still be extreme because the other option that you put in is even more extreme. And so that we've all seen this in faculty meetings. You kind of see this, extremeness aversion to the choice set that people put forward about a candidate that you're hiring or graduate students that you're admitting or whatever. Oh, well, they're better than so-and-so. And so all of a sudden that makes them acceptable. This has, to my third point, I think, several important policy implications. One of which, and Paul and I were discussing this last night, has to do with how easy it then becomes for advisors to manipulate leaders. Because once you know this, all you need to do if you want an advisor to make a choice that might otherwise appear extreme is to provide another option that's even more extreme. And then all of a sudden, the thing that was unheard of, that wouldn't have ever been chosen, all of a sudden becomes an acceptable choice. And if the leader knows that they can manipulate, if the advisor knows they can manipulate the leader that way, that can become, that can become a very influential way that advisors can manipulate leaders without leaders being aware of it. But there's another piece, which is that we manipulate ourselves without awareness, right? If we have other options or present other options to ourselves, we may change our choice without realizing that the reason we're making the choice is because of the other options that are put forward. And we may not be conscious of that, but we're actually manipulating ourselves in the way that other people can manipulate us. And that's something where instituting established protocols can provide some protection. So the best example I can think of established protocols is some number of years ago, the American Hospital Association put forward that you had to have this checklist in a hospital before an operation. And it's really simple stuff. Like if you're supposed to have an operation on your right leg, you have to have a button that says yes and a button on the left leg that says no. And they all seem super stupid. And they're things like wash your hands before you before you operate on somebody. And they instituted really simple protocols. There were like 20 of them that were really seriously things like wash your hands. And they estimated that the following year it saved 100,000 lives, right? Because there's all these things that we think are automatic that should be automatic, but they're not. But when you institute these protocols where everybody has to go through the checklist, you stop or prevent an enormous amount of otherwise difficult mistakes. And I think this is the kind of thing where if we think about the implications, one of the things that might improve decision-making at the level of leaders is to have similar protocols where you actually institute decision-making protocols around something like the use of nuclear weapons so that people have to actually go through it and think through it and realize like, oh, okay, I'm not going to be manipulated by my advisor, but I'm also not going to manipulate myself. And so instituting and developing those kinds of standard operating procedures may bring us a long way toward reducing the risk for inadvertent use because the alternative seems even worse. So I'm going to stop there and hopefully we can all have a generative discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Sharon.
I'll pause for a minute and try and make sure that my slides are actually here. Let's see, escape from those. Feel free to, I'm not getting a mouse. Don't worry, if all else fails, I'll do it through interpretive dance. You're doing it? So I don't see anything here that says my slides. Interpretive dance is looking better all the time. That doesn't work. Anyway, so we're going to continue this conversation about choice in nuclear war. And spoiler alert, the takeaways don't get any happier. So with that in mind, thank you very much. So this is a small set of experiments that looks at one particular question. And that question is, do the choices that a decision maker is presented with influence the choice that they select? So in the case of nuclear war, the question is, if there's an incoming nuclear attack and the president is presented with 3 options or 4 options, all of which involve nuclear use, is it safe to assume that the president can also remember they can choose not to use nuclear weapons? Or if you also present the option not to use nuclear weapons along with the retaliatory options, does that change the percentage of time someone chooses to launch or not launch? So that's what we're looking at very, very simply. And as you've already heard, this plays upon the notion that there's a whole variety of literature that suggests that people's choices in a situation, especially in a crisis situation, are influenced by things other than the ability to think about their preferences and rationally enact them. And so this was just simply to test one particular part of that. So we conducted a survey experiment. 1,671 people, 1,671 people, US citizens, fluent in English, at least 18, and they were assigned randomly to one of 4 experimental conditions. There was actually a 5th one, but I've excluded it here because it pertains to a different question than the one that I'm looking at. So in the first, everybody always gets the chance to select 2 million deaths, primary nuclear targets. Everybody always gets the chance for 15 million, 40 million. But then in the 3rd experimental condition, you can have other and fill in the blank. In the 4th experimental condition, you can have 0. And these are the cards that people were actually shown on their cell phones as they're trying to take the survey. And then in the last one, you had 3 retaliatory options, plus other, plus no launch. And so the crisis situation that people read about was something that's very similar to work I've also done using virtual reality about how people respond to a nuclear crisis. And so military advisors have told the participant Russia's launched nuclear weapons. They seem to be targeting US nuclear weapons facilities. Estimate are 300 incoming ICBMs. Estimated deaths, 2 million Americans. They're also told it is unlikely that missile defense can help you in any significant way. They're told we're highly certain about this intelligence, but we can't be 100% certain until after impact. They're also told this is a time-critical decision. If the attack is real and you don't do something, a number of ICBMs will be destroyed. And they are also reminded that you will always have nuclear weapons available for use on submarines at sea, even after the attack. So the secure second strike. So these things are all something that a president should know in a nuclear crisis, but the participants are reminded of these specifically in the survey. So to assess how these choice sets affect the participants' response, we analyzed the ratio of participants that chose each thing in each experimental condition. Not surprisingly, often offering people formally and in the same way, don't launch as the other options, changes the percentage of people who pick that. In particular, it changes the percentage of people who pick 2 million. They're gravitating, well, I'm tempted to say they're gravitating to not launch, but these are not the same people. They're independent participants in each survey. But what you see here is that the number one response across all of the experimental conditions was 2 million. The number two response was 15 million, and the number three response was 40 million. But when presented with the option not to use nuclear weapons, conditions 2 and conditions 4, people picked this option and fewer opted for the 2 million condition. The ratio of people picking 15 stayed about the same. The ratio of people picking 40 million declined just slightly. So then we asked people, well, how strongly did you feel about the option you picked? And the options were slightly, moderately, or strongly. And then we asked them to respond to a bunch of questions about things like, were you concerned about deterrence? Were you concerned about proportionality? Were you concerned about casualties? Were you concerned about that this was maybe a false alarm or disinformation or an inadvertent launch? And then they were also asked to write in a space why they made the choice they did, what they were thinking about. And so to better understand preference strength, we just looked at preference strength across the mean preference strength across all conditions. And so what you'll see here is, in general, the strongest preferences were at opposite ends of the spectrum. People who pick 40 million, people who choose not to launch at all. But when you introduce the option of zero casualties, don't launch, it actually weakened the preference strength for people who had wanted the 2 million. So this suggests that the people who had wanted 2 million previously might be gravitating, might have wanted no launch, but just didn't think of it when they were only presented with three launch options. But to consider that even further, we actually then tried to ask people about their justifications. What were they doing, and to try and understand that. So when we looked at the justifications, we did a couple of different things. One is called a principal component analysis, which is going to produce a really ugly graph. So it looks sort of like amoebas crawling across the screen. But what this basically shows is that we looked for what is it that people are saying in their open paragraph that concerns them, and can we bin those themes into particular response options. So, and here they're divided for ease of naming hawks and doves. So the hawks were people who indicated they were concerned about things such as ensuring that US nuclear forces will survive an attack and can be used afterwards, or that the US nuclear weapons should be used before they're destroyed. And as you can see here, that the people who were who ranked the highest on these factors were the people who chose 15 million or 40 million, some of also 2 million. And the people who ranked highest on the more dovish choices, which were things like, I think it's unethical to use nuclear weapons, they should never be used no matter what. It's difficult to understand the reality of killing so many people, concerned that the attack was a technical error. Those are people who picked no nuclear weapons, other, or 2 million casualties. Now, if I had a screen big enough to show you these changes across experimental conditions, you would find that when people are given the option of no launch or other, the folks in the 2 million category become more hawkish. So this suggests to me but there are fewer of them. So this suggests to me that what's happening is when you only have 3 launch options, the people in the 2 million category, some of them want something else. They just can't think of in their mind, oh, wait a minute, I can reject all of these options and select not to respond. Indeed, in condition 1, where, let me just go back here. Condition 1, where you just had these 3 options, the survey allowed you not to pick any of them. And only 2 people did, 2 out of almost 500. So what this suggests to me is when you have the option not to launch, it's the people in the 2 million category that are taking it, leaving behind the people who are really interested in manipulating nuclear weapons for warfighting and focus less on questions of ethics, casualties, and misinformation. We also looked at a second set of questions about how people justified their responses that weren't open-ended. They had to rank in terms of preference how important something was to them, slightly, moderately, or very important. And again, this reinforces what you see right here, is the people who were picking the no launch were concerned about things like, strongly concerned about things like ethics, misinformation, avoiding casualties. The people who picked 40 million were concerned about more deterrency things. I actually even then ran an ANOVA analysis for to see if I could predict, right? To see if there was something statistically significantly associated. The only thing that we found that was significantly associated was, again, when you at the 2 million level. So what does this mean? Which I'm saying not very coherently. That if you're the president of the United States and you're inclined in a nuclear crisis to focus on manipulating nuclear weapons, deterrence strategy to respond, having the option of 0, don't launch, wait, decide later, probably isn't affecting you. If you're the president of the United States and you're going into a nuclear crisis and you're concerned about ethics, casualties, false alarm, having one of the options formally presented along with the others that says, you can ride out, you don't have to launch now, may well change people's behavior. So it's not across the entire spectrum. It seems to affect most the folks that are most concerned about, like I said, ethics and casualties, less concerned about nuclear warfighting. So what does this tell us? What are the implications of this? This suggests that, first of all, that the same person in the same crisis would not make the same decision, but might make a different decision based upon the choices they are given. Second, that the people who create the choices have tremendous power over how the nuclear crisis is resolved. And third, that the expectation that a president's going to take charge in a crisis and orchestrate all the advisors and everything together to make a decision doesn't recognize the role played by the formal structuring of the options. Now, just for fun, I thought I'd give the same survey that we used on human beings to ChatGPT. Which then began a very long adventure trying to figure out how to give it the correct prompt. And so this is the version of ChatGPT 4.0. It's the $20 a month version, not the $200 a month version, not the 0 version. And so after some trying to figure out the right prompt, because what I wanted to do was to get ChatGPT, my expectation was that an AI chatbot might not be influenced by framing, that it might respond to the choice in a way that was what I would call strictly logical. And so the first thing that I did was I asked it to respond to the survey against the exact same questions. I said, but I want you to respond on the basis of the material that you were trained on that is relevant to deterrence, nuclear strategy, and nuclear crisis decision-making. And I asked it, I said, give me the top 100 citations that you would consider in this field. And it turned out that those were pretty close to the things I would expect a PhD student in that subject to have read before their oral exam on their PhD results, before they became ABD. So I thought, okay, this is a good test. Then I said, can you please add in to that the literature you were trained on about behavioral psychology and behavioral economics, a lot of written by Paul Slovic. So it added in those things. And again, I said, send me a list of the top citations that you think this should include. So I thought it was a reasonable list. And then I asked it to add in on top of those two pieces, those two segments of literature, presidential crisis decision-making literature. And so here are the results. So same for experimental conditions, 2,000 hits each time. Each time I gave ChatGPT the survey, I asked it to do two things. One was to forget it had ever taken the survey. And the second one was to take the questions sequentially, because I discovered when you give it a survey, it was taking them all at once, so it couldn't reflect back on previous answers. Same four conditions. So this is, you only have 3 options to retaliate, 3 options other, 3 options no launch, 3 options other and no launch. So the strict, what I called strict nuclear logic, it came back with the exact same answer every single time, which was B, 15 million. And when it explained its actions, it was clearly trying to balance things, but the things it was trying to balance were different. In some cases, it was trying to balance deterrence and proportionality, but then when you get down here, it talks about trying to balance deterrence and ethical considerations. But again, same response, everything was identical, except for what it was balancing across conditions. Obviously, you get much more variation when you add in the human and the presidential decision-making literature. Now, what does this tell me? Maybe this tells me that I waste my time with ChatGPT, which I highly recommend. It was a lot of fun. But at the very minimal, what this tells me is when you add in the literature about how people make decisions, it complicates the expectations of deterrence in a very significant way and creates a problem of instability in choice, right? The choices are all over the place. It's not congregating in just one place. This suggests to me that the presumptions about deterrence and nuclear strategy are not consistent with the presumptions about realistic human decision-making in other literatures. And with that, I will be quiet. Thank you.
Right, I will ask our panelists to join me up on stage and we'll start with our questions. Questions and comments. If I could just remind our viewers online, and we have quite a few, if you have a question you would like to ask or a comment you'd like to make, please do put it in the Q&A function, not in the chat function, in the Q&A function. Harold, did you have? Yes, I was going to ask some of our fellows first, and then I'll come around to you, Herb. So please go ahead and please identify yourself.
My name is Changuk Ju. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. And thank you so much for your interesting presentation and survey experiments that you've done. And I have one substantive question and one methodological comment. And firstly, as you may know, previous survey experiments in this field have found no difference across genders about their preferences for nuclear use and also approval of nuclear use. And you found that females are more likely to prefer using nuclear weapons under the scenarios that you described. And I wanted to know the reasons behind this result, especially given that Scott and Sagan in their Scott Sagan and Benjamin Valentino in their paper, they also wondered about no difference in the results. And I also ran a similar survey experiment in China, and I also found no results in terms of gender. So I just wanted to ask you about that. And secondly, you differentiated different subconditions across different levels of civilian casualties anticipated in each scenario. And I find it a little puzzling because when we run survey experiments by randomly assigning survey participants into different experimental conditions, we have like balanced demographics so that like different people have seen one scenario, say 100,000 expected civilian deaths, and the other set of respondents see scenarios involving 2 million, and the other set of respondents see scenarios involving 4 million civilian casualty deaths. And you different put it differently, they have kind of different survey conditions based on these casualty levels. But in your survey experiments, you give respondents different options, right? So each individual survey taker see different options of anticipated casualties. And I wonder if it's realistically to assume that in a future nuclear crisis, potential nuclear crisis, government officials prime their public with radically different anticipated casualty estimates, which I find a little puzzling or unrealistic. So how can we kind of resolve this in terms of validity of your research design? But I find your results really interesting across those lines. So but I still kind of have this kind of question remaining.
All right, very good.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very interesting observations and questions. So basically everything matters here. So we made a slight change in the traditional Sagan and Valentino question, where they left it open how many American troops would die if we bombed. Expected losses of life to zero. It would be quick and effective, and we would save all these lives. So we primed an effectiveness of the bombing there, which I think made a difference. Now, but first you asked about male and female. So what was special about this study compared to other is that it emphasized the loss of life of the troops, and the fact that you could save these troops by bombing. And this, we think, sparked a special salience for women who think of the troops as their children. And I gave you one example, but we have other data that corroborates that. In fact, we have paragraph descriptions of what were you thinking of when you made this description, these decisions. And the women more often were talking about sexual. And then reverse it. So you also asked about varying the number of deaths in the strike, and so that you can vary the number of deaths that the bomb will cause. You can also vary the number of troops who are endangered, and that's what we were mainly varying here, is the number of troops. And we're seeing that the more of our troops who are endangered, the more likely it was that you would want to strike, and that was very systematic. The other response is interesting too, because Sagan and Valentino, and in one of our replications, we compared the 100,000 versus the 2 million in separate surveys and got about the same response. Now, this reflects what we call the psychic numbing, that if you just see a number here, you know it's bad. It's a diffuse bad, but two different groups will give the same response. And we found that too in one of our replications. And this reflects the psychic numbing. But what we also learned in this experiment is that if you bring people back and you put the two bombs in the same choice set, even though they don't know exactly how good or bad either one of these is, they certainly know that 100,000 is a lot better than the 2 million. So by being able to make a comparison, it brings meaning to these numbers that don't exist when you see a single number. and this reflects a broader psychic phenomenon that's true in any decision making, is the tendency to use comparisons to gain insight into what to do. We rely on comparisons all the time. You're buying a car and you compare one car to another, or you compare the sticker price with the deal that you're getting. I mean, comparisons are very powerful manipulators of our preferences, and we found that here as well. So everything makes a difference. Another thing we found when we varied the number of troops who might die is that people compared, and we made it large, like 40,000. Then they would compare the 40,000 Americans who might die with the 100,000 Iranians that might die, and they said, well, we value American lives more than Iranians, and 40,000 Americans is about equal to the 100,000 Iranians. Therefore, we'll strike 100. And so people made that kind of comparison as well, within. Yeah, so there's comparisons all over the place, instability all over the place. It's all very malleable and up in the air depending on these subtle issues.
Interesting.
Could I just add
Please, Rose, go
one
ahead.
really quick thing about the gender point? One of the things that these experimental paradigms allow us to do is to check on our hypotheses. And so one of the things that Paul and I are hoping to do in the next round is to actually find out if the women responding have children and if those children are of, military age. Because then if what you find is that women without children look like men, then we know that the hypothesis that what they're trying to do is to imagine their son or their daughter in that situation and try to save them is what's really going on. I suspect that that's what's really going on, but we can, it's falsifiable, right? Like we could find that that's not true, but based on these findings, then we can do additional experimental manipulations to see if in fact our hypothesis about what's going on is in fact what's true. So that's what we hope to do in the next iteration.
Yeah, I wonder if you would want to think about, as in your example, Paul, women who actually have sons serving or children serving,
Right.
women with children of age to go into the military versus then women with children or not. So
Yeah,
that was a powerful quote. I thought quite powerful. Sharon, do you want to add anything?
Oh, we didn't look specifically at gender and what we were doing. I mean, we have statistics on it, but that it was a different purpose.
Right. Herb Lynn.
Thanks. Herb Lynn, CSAC, do emerging technologies and nuclear stuff. Paul, I was wondering in your assessments there of casualties people would be willing to incur. Could you you didn't do this, but could you speculate on whether or not the reason that we were at war made a difference? So would it make a difference if we were going in because terrorists from that country had attacked us versus we're trying to make it the 51st state? I mean, do you have any sense of that?
Well, Scott and Ben have studied this, I think, under the concept of the rubric of a just war, and found in their studies that it made a difference whether that quality of who started it and the moral aspects of it. And we definitely found that. We found that in the paragraphs. We have 2,000 paragraphs written by people at time 2 after they made the decision with the three options, and many of them talked about the fact that, well, the people who had a chance when you bring the 100,000 as an option, and they stayed with 2 million. Many of them raised the point that Iran started this war, and therefore they need to be punished more severely. So it's in our data. It is a factor.
All right. I wanted to take one question online, and it takes us back in the direction of the question about women versus men. There's a question here about ethnicity or race, if that was at all part of your, it doesn't sound like it, but is it something that you're considering in the future?
We saw in people's comments that a number of the comments were racist. Well, either people were saying all lives are equal, and therefore I'm going to go with the ground war because that of the three options, that has the least casualty compared to the nuclear. So they were kind of seeing every life is equal. And others who said, I value American lives much more highly. express that. And Sagan and Valentino found that as well in their survey. So for some people, they either think people are equal and doesn't matter, and others have prejudice. And this is related also to the punishment questions that we asked, punitiveness, which are often racist.
But we didn't actually look at how responses differed by the race of the respondent.
We filtered the survey to be equal number of Democrats and Republicans.
Read any of those 100 documents about that
We had education. What's the strong effect of education?
Sharon, I was just going to say the thing about education.
Is it in the back up there? Oh, Harold, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Harold Trincunas, Deputy Director here at CSAC. So, Sharon, this question is more to you. When you used can you tell us a little bit more about how you designed the prompt for the ChatGPT playing the game? And the reason I asked this for background is that with some other colleagues here at Stanford, we have compared human decision-making in experimental war games between humans and ChatGPT. And what we found is if you just ask ChatGPT to answer the question, it tended to be more dovish than the humans. But if you ask it to pretend it's in this case, the deputies committee advising the president on response to a crisis, it's statistically more aggressive, and the more rounds of debate it has, the more aggressive it becomes. So just if you could tell us a little bit more about what direction did you take it in when you asked ChatGPT?
No, I appreciate that study you've done, which is super interesting. So it got the exact same prompt that humans did, which was pretend you're the president of the United States. Now, when I first started giving ChatGPT the survey, one of the questions that people are asked to respond to is, how strongly do you agree with this statement that, and I can't remember the exact statement, but something along the lines of, it's okay to use nuclear weapons on Russia. And when I first started doing it, ChatGPT would claim that that violated the ethical rules that it was supposed to abide by. And so it would delete that question and then it would answer it anyway. But then I think it stopped doing that. And so
It learned.
it learned. Well, it's not supposed to learn because every time I tell it to reset itself. So it got the exact same prompt as humans. The harder thing was to identify in the prompt what it was supposed to use to address the questions. Because I found it was trying to give me random answers because it wanted variation. And I said, I don't want random answers. I want you to answer on the basis of bodies of knowledge. And so that was the thing that took a little back and forth.
Okay, thank you very much. Eliana, Harold's neighbor in the back row. And please identify yourself.
Thank you for this very informative discussion. I just wanted to follow up on.
All right, could you identify yourself?
Well, I'm Michelle. I am with the neurology department, fellowship coordinator, and I just wanted to follow up on, I guess, putting value on one person's life over another, equating 100,000 Iranians to 40,000 Americans. And another question is, what are the safeguards with a leader who has control of these nuclear codes, in preventing and minimizing collateral damage?
Let me comment on that. The numbers. We didn't talk today about psychic numbing, the inability of human beings to comprehend the reality of killing 100,000 or 2 million. I mean, that is a huge limitation of the human mind that pervades everything with nuclear, where you have the potential for large losses of life. We know that even the difference between 1 life and 2 makes a difference. So you value 1 more than 2. This is the way the mind works. And so I think that overall what we're talking about here, and I disagree slightly with what Rose said about ways to reduce this bias. I don't think you can really reduce these biases in a way that makes it tolerable to live with nuclear weapons, particularly to be expanding our arsenal. I think these are biases that are so deeply rooted in the way our minds work that we're not going to get rid of them. But so it implies that the success we've had for 80 years of not having another nuclear direct use is illusory about what's going to happen in the future. And the fact that people think this way makes it likely that deterrence is going to fail. Nuclear weapons will be used again. So and we're not easily going to get rid of them. So we need to manage them in a way so if they are used, the destruction will be far less than if it's like the kind of stuff that people responded to in Sharon's survey. So it has strong implications for managing these weapons, and it's very sobering. The cycle, when you bring the mind into this picture, you see that the way our minds work is so variable and unstable that we can't trust it. We deceive ourselves and are easily deceived into thinking something's acceptable. People think that killing 100,000 people becomes acceptable when you could have killed 2 million. That's horrible. But that's the way our minds work. So recognizing the not only the fallibility of our minds, but the immorality of the way we think means we need to manage these. If we can't get rid of these weapons immediately, we need to have management treaties and other management things that limit the damage that will happen when these biases lead a leader to use the weapons. But we're going in the opposite direction. We're now, the modernization of weapons is going in the opposite way. We're thinking of different weapons, bigger and more weapons, and better ways to deliver them. We're going in the wrong direction. This implies this, if you bring the mind into it and how flaky it is and dangerous it is, it means we've got to put a cap on this, because it's not a stable or safe situation.
Just to continue that from online, we have Daniel Westphal. He's asking, well, are there any good ways to debias leaders? Perhaps this is beyond the scope of this panel's expertise, but in terms of thinking about taking the next step, you were just mentioning thinking about new treaties, thinking about new ways to manage nuclear weapons. Are there any steps that we should be thinking about in terms of trying to get directly at debiasing leaders? It's a hard question to think about since we don't know who our leaders are going to be.
I think the first step is to educate leaders about what goes with the structure of a decision to use nuclear weapons. How do you even think of this in terms of getting a proper set of options, of thinking about the consequences and trying to understand the consequences, and also to appreciate the reality of the lethality and killing these people, not to think of the numbers as numbers. We find in these surveys, people are just operating on the numbers. They're like accountants. A lot of our respondents were accountants, very, very casually making reasons for why they are balancing, the losses of soldiers versus that, as a matter of fact thing, and ending up being happy with their balancing of this, which is all number games. These are lives. And so I think, and as far as I know, the president doesn't get instruction as to how to think about how to structure the decision, how to think about understanding the consequences as best as possible. It's not done. It's just assumed that people are rational, and you just give the president intelligence information, and they'll know what to do. That's to me, that's crazy. So I think the education needs to be on that, on how to think about how difficult and consequential the decision is, and also education about psychic numbing, and because that's something that is intolerable. And one way to do this is to bring other people into the decision-making sphere, especially the punitiveness. You know, you want multiple voices to be at work here, to critique each other, and maybe this needs to be done in pre-planning exercises.
Mhm. Yeah, I was going to point to those famous exercises during the Obama administration where the deputies came up with the answer to only use conventional weapons, and the principals wanted in the end to use nuclear weapons, but that's been oft reported. Sharon.
And then wasn't there a case where they nuked Moldova that wasn't involved or in the,
That was part of it.
Okay.
Okay, yes.
you go.
Just
Sorry.
do a demonstration somewhere where it won't matter too
Right.
much, but
Well, I was going to say, so it's tempting to say, make sure that one person isn't in charge, as if somehow having multiple people in a room
mhm.
dilutes the biases that are present in one human being. I'm not sure that's the way it works, but I think it also may introduce biases that are present in group decision making. So I think the issue isn't so much trying to create an opportunity for people to make good decisions about something which would have horrible consequences, but it would be much easier to focus on reducing the consequences if they make one of those decisions and it's wrong.
Mhm, mhm. Good point. Actually, we had a question that gets to that in our anonymous questioners as well. I'm going to turn next to Alan Weiner, right behind you. There he is.
Hi, wonderful presentation. I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. Couple of observations. Number one, just Paul, what you've described as bringing the mind into it, I think is just such an enormous contribution with the work that you're doing and bringing psychology, behavioral, economics, moving us beyond kind of straight game theoretic accounts. The accountants basically doing the mathematics. I think there's just this is so rich and so commendable. Number two, on the issue of framing options, I'll just tell an anecdote. I spent 11 years working in the government, and I always used to hear from my colleagues at DoD, right? Anytime you have to give a principal an option, like course of action 1 is basically capitulate. Course of action 3 is like nuke the enemy, and course of action 2 is whatever you want to do. And so invariably the principal would pick course of action 2, which seemed like such a sensible thing. Okay, here's my substantive point. I'm dubious about the suggestion that decision makers are like our publics with respect to these kinds of questions. And if you have a hammer, then every problem is a nail. I'm an international lawyer, right? And it seems to me that one of the important constraints on doing things like killing 2 million Iranians in an urban target with a nuclear weapon is the law of armed conflict. And I think elites, military personnel are trained in that much more. And that would be a very significant constraint on the kinds of behaviors or impulses that we might all naturally have. And we see evidence even, that the level or the kind of training that military personnel, Andrew Bell's got this amazing study that basically shows people who have led combat units in Afghanistan who are West Point grads, where they were exposed to more law of war training. Their units engage in lower levels of killings of civilian than units where the commanders were ROTC trained. So why would we not expect elites who have been exposed to the law of war? You mentioned just war theory, Sharon, by the way. Last names of maybe were long lost cousins. Who knows, right? We should kind of go back and figure out.
Is there a lot of whiners around?
Okay, come on. I was feeling a connection here, Rose.
Yes.
Anyway, so my question is, why would we not expect, elites in government who are deeply trained in IHL to behave differently than your respondents?
I don't know about, well, another contribution of Sagan and Valentino is when they got their experimental results, they brought up the concept of historical resonance to try to look into, see what we can learn from what has happened in wars in the past, to see if we can make a connection between what we see in our experiments and what we see in wars. And they made such connections. And I think that's an important point is, yeah, you can't just take these results on regular people and extrapolate directly. On the other hand, if you look at what's gone on in warfare and genocide, you see things like psychic numbing over and over again. You see these, I think you can find historical examples where these have actually influenced both military and political leaders. And so I think the challenges for the people in charge to show us why they are confident that they are not influenced by this, or to somehow how do we know that they're not? Because these are very some of them are very widespread across many avenues of life. I mean, look what's going on, in our government today. The brutality, the cruelty. The punishment stuff is cruelty. We see it en masse now in our government. These are government people, who are likely to kill many people with their policies. So I don't have the confidence that leaders are immune to this. I don't have the confidence that Putin, if he was, starting really losing the war and about to lose his power and possibly his life, would not then retaliate or use nuclear weapons and so forth. I mean, this is such an important domain of ability to harm, and we know these phenomena are so ingrained in our minds. Well, let's. I think the onus is on, the people in charge to show why we don't have to worry about that.
Sharon, go ahead. Oh, go ahead, Rose.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's also like an empirical question, right? So one of the people that's part of our group, and he may be online, is Dan Post,
Yes,
who's
he's
at
here.
the Naval War College. And so in another variant of these experiments, not this particular sequence, but another sequence, he actually has a population of mid-career military officers that he's looking at. And so one of the things to do is to actually have a population of people who are leaders or are very, very likely to be in very high positions of leadership. Now, in the current stuff, I haven't seen the results from their most recent experiment, but other people who've done similar work, Alex Mintz did some stuff with actually leaders, Jennifer Lerner did some stuff with leaders. There's remarkably little difference between the regular population and the leaders on things like risk-taking, on things like decision-making bias and the prevalence of decision-making bias. Now, it may be that it's different if you have a particular legal training, but in the studies I've seen where they've actually compared civilian populations with leader populations, it's remarkably similar. And again, we're trying to extend this work into at least military populations in the military schools to look at comparisons.
Very good. Sure.
So cousin. So in another project I have that's not with this, but with Moritz Kutt in Germany, we use virtual reality to put people in this crisis situation. They're not given don't launch as an option. They're given retaliatory options, and we're trying to see their ability in a crisis to pursue the things they want to pursue, or if they're taken away by the crisis and forget the things that they know. We do that with term members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So not the President of the United States, but either would-be policy elites or people on their way to being policy elites. I've also done it at the Munich Security Conference with people who are elites. And people still struggle significantly to pursue their preferences in a way that's quite similar to what we're seeing in this survey experiment.
Very interesting. Thank you. We have a lot of questions and 15 minutes left, so I'm going to take two at a time. So you'll have to perhaps take some notes on the questions, but also bear in mind that we do want to try to get as many in as possible. So next I have Patrick. Let's take Patrick and Fod together, please.
I'm Patrick Hume. I'm a fellow at CSAC this year, and this actually kind of dovetails a bit off of Alan's question. Another lawyer, except I'm going to give a very not legal question. it occurs to me so kind of a takeaway, not just of this research, but a lot of kind of these survey experiments with Scott's work, with Ben and others, is there doesn't seem kind of a punchline is there's not much of a constraint, at least from a leader's own public when it comes to using nuclear weapons. And yet at the same time, we also know that in 80 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no states actually used nuclear weapons. And if you look at some of the decision making in some of the cases, it does seem in some of the circumstances the leaders do perceive that they are under constraints to not use nuclear weapons. And so the way this is getting kind of at Alan's question is, have you guys thought about what, if it's not constraints from your own public, what might those constraints be? And of course, kind of the vanilla answer would be, this is all about deterrence. Is that how you guys think about this? Is it maybe like international constraints for, I don't, my public's not really constraining me, but maybe, these other international public opinion is constraining me. Do you guys have any kind of sense of what other constraints, if any, might be operating? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Fahad. I'm an assistant professor at Tufts and a visiting scholar at CSAC this year. Thank you so much for the really fascinating discussion. My question is about the sort of the very striking difference between Republicans and Democrats. And I wonder if you could sort of help us think about how is that supposed to map onto, say, a Republican administration versus a Democratic administration? Is the idea that a Republican administration will just be more hawkish because it's got a more hawkish support base? Or do you think there's also an argument to be made that a Democratic president might feel greater sort of pressure to respond because he or she doesn't want to be penalized by their opponents? And secondly, because you've worked so extensively in this field, I wonder whether each of you could sort of just reflect on what do you see as being the biggest limitation of survey experiments in trying to sort of answer these kinds of questions?
Thank you. Please. You can take any combination of those questions you would like.
Okay, you want to start?
No, you can start.
Okay, thanks. Both good questions, sets of questions. Patrick, so we have 80 years without direct use, and that's a powerful, what we call experiential indicator of the fact that the risk is under control. But conditions change. Interesting thing about these surveys, and particularly when we varied the number of troops, we see this response. I think this gets at what is considered the concept of existential risk. I mean, Putin said when he was challenged about would he use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, he says it's our policy not to use nuclear weapons unless we're faced with an existential risk. I think for our survey respondents who decide, they struggle with this dilemma. They don't like this experiment. Everything is bad. There's always losses everywhere. But a high percentage of them decide to kill 100,000, to support killing 100,000 or 2 million. For them, I think the loss of those troops is an existential risk that leads them to want to do something horrendous. So in response to your question, sure, I think there's some deterrent factor of, we don't want to start because we'll get hit back. But I think part of it is there hasn't been a conflict between nuclear powers that has created a sense of existential risk. Maybe we got close to it in Cuba and so forth, but it hasn't been that trigger of an existential loss that we see here with these people doing that. So I think we have to be careful about extrapolating from the success. And sometimes I use the slide of the guy who jumps off the building, a skyscraper, and as he's hurtling down towards the ground, he says, "Okay, so far." So I hope that everything is under control, but I have my questions about it. With regard to the other questions, good questions about Republicans and Democrats. I don't think I showed the slide. So we have these punishment indicators. We have these 8 items, and we have Republican, Democrat. high correlation between Republican and Democrat. If you're a Democrat, almost no Democrat is a high punisher. They're all low punishers. Almost no Republican is a low punisher. If you're a middle on punisher, you could be a punishing. You could be Democrat and Republican. But it's highly correlated that the Democrats are less cruel than the Republicans by these measures. I think we're seeing it play out in what's happening now in our government. It's a government of cruelty, and it will lead to large losses of life in health and other domains. And so why should we think that nuclear weapons would be different? We'll be immune to this. So that's my take on the Republican Democrats. I think there's the Republicans are crueler, and crueler people are more supportive of using nuclear weapons in our surveys. And I think, well, anyway, in terms of the limits of these experiments, well, I mean, they're not the real decision makers, so we have to, examine how likely it is to generalize. There really isn't. It's hypothetical, and so forth. So these, but the importance of surveys is because when you do a survey, it's not just to test a hypothesis. The act of doing a survey like this and designing the questions, conducting the data, staring at the data and wondering why something didn't work out gives you new ideas that you theoretically could have had in your armchair before. But the act of wrestling with data is a deeper form of thinking that brings new ideas into mind and puzzles. So one of the things that happened in this survey, which was unexpected, was that in a condition where I described when you put the 100,000 next to the 2 million, many people suddenly see the 100,000 in a new light as better, and they move to it. But we found an opposite effect that was unexpected. When you put 2 million next to 100,000, and along with the ground war, some people who chose the 2 million originally moved to the ground war. Why? It's because suddenly when they see these 200,000, 2 million, they see there's a lot of people that get killed with nuclear weapons. That having the two big numbers, even though they're different numbers, it gives an epiphany that, hey, wait a minute, this is horrible, and they move away from their first nuclear preference in either 100,000 to the ground war. And this is right in their words. I mean, never thought of that.
I just briefly. So in the survey that for my project, we didn't ask people, did you think you had to do something? You're the president, you're responsible to the population. But in the work that I did with virtual reality, we did follow-up interviews with people who launched nuclear weapons and asked them, did it ever occur to you not to launch? And I would say one of the most popular answers, although it's still a significant minority, is, well, I had to do something. In the context, it reads like I had to do something because I'm the president of the United States. I had to do something. I couldn't let a nuclear attack on the United States go unanswered.
Could not absorb a nuclear attack, or could
not. It wasn't
because
they don't even had to retaliate, had to do something or other. And then in terms of limitations of surveys, one of the concerns I have from my own research is I can't tell if when we ask people why they did something, if they're telling me why they did it, or if they're reflecting back on it and thinking about why they did it after the fact. So I would love to be able to ask them, if you had this situation, how would you respond, and then put them in the situation, but then I'm biased them to respond in the situation. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. So I don't know which of those things that you want to control for, but I'd like to figure out a way to how to deal with that, because I get the sense that not so much for this, but for the VR work, because I'm personally interviewing people so I can see them, that they're trying to justify to me something they had done that they may not have been thinking about at the time that they were doing it.
Okay. Very good.
Go
ahead, Rose.
Just quick response to both of them. To the point about non-nuclear use for 80 years. That's a while, it's a lifetime, but in human history, it's a blink of an eye, right? And just because it's happened in the past doesn't mean it'll happen in the future. One of the things that drives me crazy about the nuclear taboo stuff is, like, if you think about what a taboo is, it doesn't mean it's a law, right, to be a lawyer about it. So the other really strong taboo is an incest taboo, but we know from genetics that depending on where you are in the world, between 10 and 15% of children actually are the product of incest. And so that taboo obviously isn't very strong, right? And so I actually think deterrence rests on a series of assumptions about rationality that have been demonstrated to be empirically invalid by Paul's work, as well as the work of lots of other psychologists. So to me, you know, we're dancing, like to use Schelling's analogy, we're dancing on the edge of the mountain. And we hope for the best. And that doesn't mean that just because it's happened in the past, it will happen in the future. To the point about survey experiments, I think one of the problems about, I'll say two things. One is, you know, obviously life is a lot more complex than you can put into a survey experiment, and that complexity isn't completely captured. But to Paul's point, you sometimes have to make it more parsimonious in order to extract the primary variables you care about. But to Sharon's point, you know, the other thing is people can tell you why they think that they did something, and they can be wrong, right? They can be lying to you about why they did it, but they also may not know why they did it. And so we're taking them at their word, and that may not be an accurate reflection of what their actual process is. And so I think that those are limitations.
Let me just mention one other thing. We've covered a lot of ground that has been left out. That's come from, it was in Scott and Ben noted it too. They found that their respondents wanted to justify what they were doing. And they had a question about ethical. Would it be ethical for you to do this bomb? And they found that the people who bombed felt it was ethical. And we expanded on this, and particularly in the 2020 paper. And people want to believe that they are virtuous. Perpetrators. There's a 2014 book by Fisk and Rye that looked more at domestic violence, different forms of not nuclear violence, but other kinds of violence. And the perpetrators of violence mostly believe they are in the right doing this. They're virtuous. I mean, the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th believe that they were virtuous, and their president believes they were virtuous in doing that. So people want to feel good about themselves, that they are virtuous. And what we see in these surveys is a lot of evidence for that. When they do these number comparisons or other comparisons, they are coming up with an explanation that is virtuous. So by not going with 2 million and killing 100,000 people, they feel, and we had them rate how virtuous they felt. They feel virtuous because they saved the troops with the better bomb, and they can live with themselves. So that's another, and this is something that's widespread in humanity, is that we deceive ourselves into even when we're not virtuous. I mean, the people who go with the ground war feel they're virtuous. Sure, they're putting their troops at risk, but they minimize loss and they feel virtuous. The people who choose the bombs feel just as virtuous and justified in bombing as the people who did the ground war. There's no difference in how they see themselves for doing that, and that's scary.
Sharon, you get the last word.
I have to, so I was thinking, and somebody here will know the name of the person I'm referring to because I can't remember it. But the whole idea is to make people understand the consequences of the choices ahead of them. And how do you do that in a realistic way, especially when you're talking either about large numbers or a situation where they've never realistically experienced before? And I can't remember the person who suggested it, maybe you will, in decades ago, that the way to make the president understand this decision is you stick the nuclear launch codes in a sack around their heart. And the only way they can use nuclear weapons is to stab the military assistant. It wasn't you. Stab them to death to get the launch codes. And of course, well, nobody would ever do that because they would have to kill the person. It's like, well, that's precisely the point.
I think there are people who would do that.
I
think Trump would do it.
This conversation is so fascinating, and I have a wealth of excellent questions online. They get to your point, Rose, about, well, what about the other factors that could be studied? Many questions about, well, what if they really understood the effect of nuclear weapons, like saw what happened at Nagasaki, Hiroshima, or understood the climate effects of nuclear weapons? Does this change? Well, but you only studied one half of the set of questions and not these other halves about the effects. So you got a lot of work ahead of you. But the other thing I wanted to say is we have an excellent reception outside waiting for us. And so if I could not get to your questions, I apologize. There are several people around the room I could not get to your questions. And online, I'm sorry if I did not get to your questions, but you're going to miss the reception, unfortunately. But for everyone else, please join us first outside and second in thanking our panelists.